At midnight, Emma stirred awake, the soft hum of the old house around her broken only by the ticking of the hallway clock. The moonlight spilled through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow across her bedroom floor, and she rubbed her eyes, feeling a strange mix of restlessness and curiosity. She had barely slept, though she couldn't explain why. It was as if the quiet of the house carried a weight she hadn't noticed before. With careful steps, she left her bedroom, her bare feet pressing softly against the cool wooden floor, and made her way to the bathroom. As she rounded the corner of the hallway, a sliver of light caught her attention, faint, yet unfamiliar, seeping from the guest room door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she paused, listening. The house had been quiet all evening, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window the only sound, and yet here was a light that didn't belong. She leaned slightly against the wall, trying to convince herself it was nothing, that perhaps Daniel, her sister's husband, had woken up, or maybe he had forgotten to turn off the lamp. But before she could continue, a shadow moved in the hallway, a figure stepping into the dim glow, and Emma froze, startled. It was Daniel. His tall frame loomed in the soft light, and for a brief moment, both of them simply looked at each other, caught off guard. He seemed equally surprised, his eyes wide, a small frown crossing his face as he whispered, "Emma?" She felt her pulse quicken, a strange, unfamiliar tension threading through the quiet of the night. Neither of them moved for a few seconds, the silence stretching, charged with an unspoken energy that made the air feel heavier, almost intimate in its stillness. Emma shifted slightly, forcing herself to speak, to break the spell that seemed to suspend them both in that hallway. I'm just going to the bathroom," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, though it seemed to echo in the empty house. Daniel's lips twitched in what could have been a smile or a nervous reaction. He stepped aside, giving her room to pass, but neither of them turned away immediately. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met again, and the world outside the hallway ceased to exist. Emma felt a flicker of something she couldn't name, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and a strange sense of longing, yet tinged with guilt for feeling anything at all. Her heart pounded louder in her chest as she hurried past him, glancing at his face once more, trying to read what was behind his calm exterior, but Daniel's expression remained carefully neutral, unreadable. She closed the bathroom door quietly behind her, leaning against it for a brief second to steady herself, feeling a rush of warmth and tension from the encounter. The light from the hallway seemed brighter now, almost as if it had absorbed the energy of their shared glance. Emma washed her hands, staring at her reflection in the mirror, catching herself smiling faintly at the memory of Daniel's face, the way his presence had suddenly filled the hallway with an unspoken emotion she hadn't expected. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the flutter in her chest, telling herself it was nothing, that it was just a late-night surprise, a fleeting moment that didn't matter. But deep down, she sensed that something had shifted, that the quiet house and the midnight hour had allowed a crack to open in the ordinary rhythm of life, letting a feeling through that would not easily be forgotten. As she stepped out of the bathroom and back into the dim hallway, the light from the guest room still spilling softly across the floor, she realized that even though the encounter had lasted mere seconds, it lingered, settling in her mind like a melody that plays quietly in the background, impossible to ignore. Emma returned to her bedroom slowly, the house still asleep, but her thoughts racing, questioning why that brief meeting in the hall had felt so charged, so important, and why the image of Daniel standing there, waiting, had etched itself so clearly into her mind. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket around her, yet sleep seemed impossible now. Her mind replayed the hallway, the quiet steps, the soft glow, and the fleeting moment of connection that seemed to hold more weight than either of them could acknowledge in the stillness of the night. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the clock ticking in the background, and realized that nothing would feel quite the same in the house again, not with him here, not after this midnight encounter. Even though she told herself it was nothing, that it was just a brief, innocent moment in a quiet house, a part of her knew it was the beginning of something subtle, something that would quietly unfold in the days ahead, something that would stir emotions she hadn't anticipated and challenge the careful boundaries she had always maintained in her sister's home. Emma's days passed in a strange rhythm after that midnight encounter, the house feeling both familiar and new, as if Daniel's presence had quietly altered its energy. Portland winters were cold, and the gray light of morning seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Her sister Claire had called earlier in the week, apologizing for leaving so suddenly, explaining that a work emergency required her immediate attention, and asked Emma to look after Daniel while she was away. Emma had agreed easily, telling herself it was only a short visit, just a couple of nights, and that Daniel was her sister's husband, someone she could handle with the politeness and warmth she usually reserved for guests. At first, everything seemed normal. Daniel kept to himself, reading quietly in the guest room, joining Emma for meals but speaking in calm, careful tones. He smiled politely, occasionally sharing small stories about work or Vancouver, where he and Claire lived, and Emma responded with simple questions, maintaining a comfortable distance. But as the days passed, she began to notice things she hadn't expected, small shifts in the atmosphere, glances that lingered a moment longer than necessary, pauses in conversation where the weight of unspoken thoughts hung in the air. Daniel seemed restless, as though the walls of the house were pressing in on him, and he often stood by the window for long minutes, staring out at the street below as if searching for something he couldn't name. Emma found herself drawn to these quiet moments, watching him from a distance, feeling a strange pull she didn't quite understand, even as she reminded herself to maintain boundaries. She caught him sighing softly at times, and there were evenings when he seemed distracted, lost in memories he didn't share, a tension beneath his calm exterior that made her heart ache. Emma's curiosity grew, and she began to wonder about his life, about the parts of his marriage Claire hadn't shared, about the struggles and quiet longings he carried with him. She told herself repeatedly that her feelings were only empathy, only concern for a guest in her home, but she couldn't deny the way her chest tightened when she saw him quietly staring out the window or the way her thoughts lingered on him long after he left the room. Meals became a careful dance of polite conversation and lingering silences, both of them aware of the undercurrent they couldn't name, and Emma felt a thrill mixed with guilt each time their eyes met and held for a second longer than necessary. Even the ordinary tasks of the house, pouring coffee, setting the table, washing dishes, suddenly seemed charged with subtle tension, each glance or word carrying a weight that made Emma's thoughts swirl. She caught herself replaying the hallway encounter from midnight over and over, imagining what she would have said, what he might have felt, and a quiet longing settled in her heart that she couldn't shake. At night, the house felt alive in a different way, the silence stretching and amplifying every sound, every movement, every tiny flicker of emotion between them. Daniel, 4. His part, remained polite, measured, careful, never crossing boundaries, yet Emma sensed that he too carried a weight, a quiet melancholy that mirrored her own hidden feelings. Conversations became more personal, more open, though always framed in the safe spaces of empathy and shared human experience, touching on subjects like life changes, dreams deferred, and the quiet disappointments that people rarely admit aloud. Emma found herself laughing more, sharing small jokes, and feeling a warmth she hadn't expected, a subtle connection that left her both exhilarated and anxious. She spent evenings observing him from the kitchen doorway, noting the way his fingers traced the rim of a coffee cup, the slight slump of his shoulders, the faint tension in his jaw when he thought no one was watching. And yet, in all these moments, she reminded herself that this was temporary, that boundaries existed, that Claire was away for a reason, and that whatever stirred in her heart had to remain unspoken. Each day felt like a slow unraveling of the quiet rhythm of the house, a gentle building of a tension she couldn't name but could feel in every glance, every sigh, every fleeting smile shared across rooms. And while Emma tried to focus on her own life, her routines, and her work, the awareness of Daniel's presence hung in the background, like a quiet music she could not stop hearing, the melody subtle but insistent, making her wonder about the stories behind his silences, the moments that had made him restless, and the emotions that seemed to follow him through the rooms of her house. She began to notice patterns, the way he lingered at the window in the late afternoon light, the thoughtful pause before he answered a question, the way he looked at familiar objects with a faraway expression. Each observation added to her understanding of him, and each understanding brought a new layer of connection she hadn't anticipated, a quiet empathy that bordered on something deeper but remained unspoken, restrained by the knowledge that he belonged to her sister. Evenings grew longer as the winter stretched, and Emma found herself thinking about him more often than she wanted, wondering about the loneliness she sensed in him, the fatigue he carried, and the quiet longing in his eyes. She caught herself imagining conversations that could never happen, imagining moments that would remain only in her mind, and felt a gentle ache in her chest, a mixture of sadness, admiration, and something she didn't dare define. In quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed distant, Emma realized that Daniel's presence had changed the rhythm of her life, that his quiet restlessness and unspoken emotions had woven themselves into the fabric of her days, creating a tension that was impossible to ignore, a soft mystery that pulled at her heart and kept her awake at night, replaying the hallway moment over and over, and wondering what it all meant for the short time he would stay in her home.as. The days passed, the quiet tension in the house grew heavier, and Emma could no longer ignore the subtle pull she felt toward Daniel, a pull that was both confusing and intense. Mornings began with a careful routine of polite conversation, breakfast quietly shared in the small kitchen, the clinking of cutlery punctuating moments of unspoken understanding. She noticed the way he paused before speaking, the faint way his eyes softened when he looked at her, as if he was struggling with words he didn't dare voice. Emma tried to distract herself with chores, with books, and with the small tasks that filled her day, yet she found her thoughts constantly drifting back to him, back to the warmth in his gaze, the quiet depth in his tone, the way the silence between them felt charged with something neither dared to name. They spent the afternoons in the living room, Daniel reading while Emma worked on her laptop, and though they didn't speak much, the proximity felt like a quiet intimacy, a shared space that neither had to explain. She caught herself glancing at him often, noting the subtle details, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the arm of the chair when he was thinking, the faint crease on his forehead when he concentrated, the way his lips curved slightly when he smiled to himself. One evening, as snow fell outside, she found herself sitting across from him at the kitchen table, a cup of tea warming her hands, while he spoke softly about the challenges of long-distance work, the quiet loneliness of nights spent away from family, and the pressures he felt trying to balance expectations with reality. Emma listened intently, her heart heavy with empathy.